Good afternoon. Today we have decided to keep the key rate at 4.25% per annum. The economy is bouncing back rather steadily. I would like to remind you that at our previous meeting we expected economic revival to pause at the end of 2020. However, GDP statistics and high-frequency indicators evidence that this did not happen. Moreover, inflation also exceeds our expectations. I will further on dwell on the factors which we were taking into account when making our decision today. I will start out with the situation in the economy. It has turned out to be better than we expected, and there is a range of reasons for this. First, the restrictions in autumn and winter were not as tough as in spring. Second, both households and businesses were better prepared for the resurgence of coronavirus cases and adjusted faster. Credit activity did not decline, and consumer demand remained unchanged, including owing to a rise in online purchases. Third, external demand for Russian exports also turned out to be higher than our expectations. We assume that demand in the economy will be recovering steadily further on, promoted by lending expansion amid accommodative monetary policy, mass vaccination, and an improvement in household and businesses' sentiment. Over the acute phase of the crisis, budget spending considerably supported the real sector. The effect of stimulus measures is expected to continue in the first half of the year as well. Further on, the scheduled fiscal policy normalization will reduce the extent of this influence. Nonetheless, the budget will remain expansionary as compared to the long-term parameters provided for by the fiscal rule. In these conditions, economic growth will continue owing to a further revival of both domestic and external demand. The recovery of domestic demand will be driven by the cancellation of restrictions as the epidemic situation improves, especially in the service sector. External demand will be boosted by a rebound in the global economy. Disinflationary demand-side pressure will thus be decreasing overall. Given the current positive trends, we keep unchanged our forecast of GDP growth at 3 to 4% for 2021. Furthermore, the economy may reach its pre-pandemic levels already by late 2021 and not by mid-22, as we assumed earlier. This will become possible primarily as a result of a less significant decline in 2020. The second factor is inflation. Annual inflation sped up to 5.2% in January, exceeding the Bank of Russia's target. This elevated inflation rate largely resulted from the pass-through of the ruble weakening and price growth in global commodity markets. According to our estimates, the contribution of the pass-through of the exchange rate movements to annual inflation approximated 1 percentage point. The contribution of high prices in food markets was slightly lower, yet substantial. Given increased inflation expectations and supply-side restrictions, these factors may have a longer-lasting effect on prices. The pass-through of last year's ruble depreciation to prices still continues, although it is waning. Recently, prices could be affected not only by ruble exchange rate fluctuations in the second half of 2020, but also its weakening in spring, when enterprises were unable to revise their prices immediately due to a slump in demand. Eventually, the combination of the two episodes of the ruble depreciation may be a reason why inflation expectations will stay elevated for a longer period. Upward pressure on domestic prices persists due to the situation in global commodity markets, first and foremost in food markets. Food prices have risen because of reduced inventories and unfavorable weather conditions. Moreover, the growth of prices for cereals increases costs in meat product manufacturing and is not only a pro-inflationary factor in itself, but it may also entail secondary effects. It is worth noting that the new mechanisms of export duties in grain markets will smooth out the influence of global prices fluctuations on domestic prices. Finally, inflation is still affected by a group of factors associated with the epidemic situation. It includes staff shortages in a number of industries, increased costs incurred by companies to comply with sanitary and epidemiological rules, and persistent temporary delays in supplies due to disruptions in logistic chains. These are supply-side factors putting upward pressure on inflation. Given the nature of these processes, we estimate that annual inflation will pass its peak in February, March, after which it will be going down incrementally. This will become possible as the impact of the above pro-inflationary factors is gradually exhausted. Beginning from March, the statistical base effect will also play a significant role in the decrease in annual inflation. Taking into account the monetary policy pursued, we forecast that prices will grow by 3.7 to 4.2% over the year. The third factor we were taking into account when making our today's decision is that monetary conditions remain accommodative. While nominal interest rates on loans and deposits changed only slightly, real price conditions were eased. Banks also continued to ease non-price lending conditions on a range of segments. Yields on federal government bonds increased somewhat amid the growth of long-term interest rates in global financial markets. Owing to the monetary policy pursued and the government's anti-crisis support measures, the increase in the banking system's claims on companies accelerated to 10.2% last year, which is more than in 2019. The growth rate of claims on households equaled 12.9%. The economy and borrowers obtained the funds they needed to more smoothly overcome the acute phase of the crisis and resume development. In 2021, monetary conditions will remain accommodative, further promoting lending expansion despite the expected gradual termination of preferential programs. The banking system's claims on companies are forecast to increase by 7 to 11% this year, and those on households by 14 to 18%, largely as a result of the accelerated expansion of mortgage lending. As regards fluctuations in banking sector liquidity observed in recent months, they had no impact on monetary conditions. As before, the Bank of Russia preserved money market rates close to the key rate. This became possible owing to the streamlined operational procedure, which is efficient amid both a deficit and a surplus of liquidity. Today, we have published the Bank of Russia's updated baseline forecast. It relies on the following assumptions. First of all, external conditions have become more promising. The global economy is expected to grow faster owing to mass vaccination and additional fiscal stimuli in advanced economies. This will strengthen external demand for Russian exports. Therefore, we have increased our forecast of oil prices from $45 to $50 per barrel for 2021 and 2022. Nonetheless, our forecast remains conservative given the high uncertainty about a potential further spread of the pandemic. According to our estimates, a faster recovery of the demand for oil may translate to a greater extent into a rise in oil output rather than oil prices. As regards the 2022 to 2023 horizon, our forecast remains unchanged. The economy will expand by 2.5 to 3.5% in 2022 and by 2 to 3% in 2023. Given the monetary policy pursued, inflation will return to the target at the end of 2021 and stay close to 4% further on. I will now speak on possible risks to the forecast. Disinflationary risks do not prevail any longer in 2021. Moreover, these is generally a balance between pro-inflationary and disinflationary risks over the forecast horizon. Pro-inflationary risks include, first and foremost, a possible rise in prices in global commodity markets. Second, the epidemic situation remains one of the least predictable factors. Its potential worsening will be the reason why companies' costs will stay high, with goods transportation problems and production chain disruptions persisting. Third, inflation expectations may remain elevated for a long period of time. Fourth, it is worth emphasizing that economic rebound may be even uneven and involve local price spikes in individual segments. For instance, as restrictions are lifted in the service sector hardest hit by the pandemic, an increase in demand amid an insufficient rise in supply may become a temporary pro-inflationary factor. The scale and duration of its impact will depend on a new balance between demand and supply, households' behavior, changes in consumer preferences, and the pace of the cancellation of restrictions on foreign travels. Fifth, we will take into account persistent geopolitical risks as they may affect yield trends and inflation and exchange rate expectations. The second group of risks include disinflationary factors. First of all, the fiscal policy normalization may have a more significant influence on final demand and, accordingly, price movements. Second, the uncertainty regarding future consumer behavior remains. During the quarantine and long self-isolation period, a lot of people abandoned some services, formed new consumption preferences, and changed their mode of life. We do not know whether they will become steady and how they will be influencing price trends. Third, after the boundaries are reopened, it is natural to expect that the demand will shift towards outbound tourism services. As labor migrant flows and logistics chains restore, this will become a disinflationary factor. Finally, as the restrictions are eased, companies will be able to reduce their costs for the sanitation of their premises and the anti-pandemic protection of their staff and customers, which will ease pressures on businesses' costs. In conclusion, I would like to comment on monetary policy prospects. The accommodative monetary policy and the government's package of anti-crisis measures have been promoting economic revival after the acute phase of the crisis. According to our estimates, we consider that the potential for monetary policy easing has been exhausted. Its further easing could additionally increase pro-inflationary risks. Nonetheless, monetary policy will remain accommodative on average throughout 2021, supporting the recovery of the Russian economy. The baseline scenario provides for a gradual return to neutral monetary policy. We will assess the timeline and pace for this return, taking into account our goal to maintain inflation at our target. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I am ready to answer your questions. The first question comes from Elena Fabricna, Reuters. So it turns out that the easing cycle ended in July last year. Could the transfer to the neutral policy start this year already? Well, it is true. We are of the opinion that the easing cycle is over in our baseline scenario, and we will definitely be monitoring the way the situation unfolds. Let me remind you that in the main guidelines of our monetary policy, we considered different scenarios. There were 4 of them, and taking into account the uncertainty, we will further update them. But right, the baseline scenario shows that the easing cycle has come to an end, and we're going to discuss the time frame within which we will switch over to the neutral policy and the pace of this as the situation evolves. Now, when this is going to happen, I also mentioned that will depend upon the situation, so it is premature to talk about any specific timeline. Anastasia Saveleva, Interfax, good afternoon. We don't hear you. There's no sound. Well, the next question then, while the sound is being restored, I think we've got a bit of a technicality with it. Anastasia Saprikina, RIA Novosti, the central bank in its press release stated that it is waiting for the inflation peak in February-March. What is the level of it that you are forecasting? Don't you expect that in April, with the oil and sugar price stabilization agreement being suspended, the inflation may speed up again? We expect the annual inflation to reach its peak indeed in February-March. And with regards to the monthly data, that would probably happen in February sooner. I mean, but if you take a look at the weekly annualized inflation, that may happen in the first half of March. And afterwards, we will see the last year's base effect becoming more pronounced. Let me remind you that over the second half of March last year, prices spiked, and that will definitely impact the annual inflation. The level of it we estimate to be somewhere with around 5.5%. And after that, the annual inflation will start its decline. And as far as suspending the oil and sugar price agreement stabilization being suspended, we don't expect that to produce quite an effect upon the overall inflation, particularly since we are aware that it has to be a bit of a gradual move, and we don't expect prices to spike up. Good afternoon, Rita Spilevske from TAS, please. Yes, good afternoon, dear Elvira Nabiullina. My question is, in addition to our colleague from RIA Novosti, you identified the factors which are pro-inflationary, which is basically the enterprise cost to comply with the sanitary norms. I would like to ask a question: how strong an impact that can produce upon achieving the target level of 4% of inflation next year? This factor indeed is what we are reserving right now, but as the epidemiological situation improves and the restrictions are lifted, we believe that this factor is going to subside in its effect, and overall we cannot, speaking about the inflation expectations, we do assess all possible drivers and factors, and so in our view we will be able to return the inflation to 4% as the target within the mid-term perspective. And also this year, towards the end of it, we've come out with an interval kind of an estimate, but that is going to be the inflation close to 4%, while for next year, all of our modeling shows that with the monetary policy we pursue, we'll be able to achieve the 4% target. Without doubt, if some of the factors are going to be stronger, that may require adjustment of our monetary policy, and we're ready for that. Anastasia Saveleva from Interfax. Once again, good afternoon. Yeah, can you hear me now? I hope. Yes, we do. Previously, you mentioned that in the beginning of 2021, you're going to start publishing the key rate trajectory forecast. Have you made up your mind in terms of the format that this trajectory is going to be disclosed, and when specifically you may start publishing it? We plan to disclose the trajectory of the key rate in April, following the next core board of directors meeting. And this forecast will indeed include the kind of vision that the board of directors has in terms of the key rate evolution into the future. But at the same time, I would like to draw your attention that this expected trajectory is not going to be a dotted kind of line. It will reflect all of the spectrum of model estimations within the scenario conditions that have been taken into account during the times when we debated this issue at the Board of Directors meetings. Next question, Dmitry Butrin, Kommersant. What are the industries, heirs of the economy, based on your estimate, the output in 2021 could be close to its potential or above it? Yes, we do see a certain unevenness, not only in the way the economy recovers, but also the way it nears its potential. The rebounding is slower in the service sector. because of restrictions remaining, and it is still far from its potential. But it doesn't mean that in some of the sectors the output is below the potential, that doesn't produce the price pressure, because the price pressure may appear in a faster demand recovery, but when the supply is lagging behind, and that is one of the issues that we are monitoring. But there are industries indeed wherein the potential has already been achieved, and in some cases even higher. Construction industry, for example, in some of the regions, construction materials, domestic travel in some of the regions is definitely what we can see, but overall maybe the housing and construction industry as well. Thank you. Next question, Andrei Biryukov, please. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. Previously, you were saying that the monetary is going to remain accommodative throughout the whole of the 2021. Could you confirm that that holds, or is it already something outdated in terms of the trajectory of the key rate will be a different one? We believe that in the base scenario, on average, the monetary policy throughout 2021 will remain an accommodative one, and in this way will promote the recovery of the economics. Pavel Kazarnovsky, RBK Agency. What is the level that inflation should reach in order for the central bank to switch over to raising the key rate, and what are the factors that the central bank is going to rely upon in the first place in order to make this decision? Whenever we make a decision on the rate, we certainly pay attention to the current inflation, because this is an important element, but first and foremost at the inflation forecast and the factors which affect it, because our monetary policy generates effects with a bit of a lag, and so in many ways that reflects the financial and monetary services in the future. There are cases when inflation is high, but we understand that it has been brought about by temporary, even though strong, but temporary kind of factors which will bear a very short-lived effect, and in this case the monetary effect under such conditions may not respond to it at all. So whenever we make up our mind about either raising the rate or keeping it as is, that involves a whole comprehensive set of considerations. And if the inflation forecast specifically stabilizes close to the 4% level, that is the time to revert back to the neutral monetary policy. We similarly mentioned it previously. Whenever we see that the economy is close to its potential, that the gaps are being closed and the inflation stabilizes close to 4%, that is the marker in order to revert back to the neutral policy. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. I have a couple of questions, if I may. If I'm not mistaken, you mentioned that can you hear me better now? If I'm not mistaken, in your presentation you mentioned that the central bank believes that the food prices are going to be slightly higher than it was expected previously. Could you be more specific? When does central bank expect the price movement to turn around? And the second question, we have a certain precedent when the risk of, let's say, self-fulfillment of a certain community, business community or household community, could bear a systemic impact. And so would you believe that it may not become so? And well, as far as your question is concerned about food prices and its influence over inflation. I may have misheard your question, so please bear with me. Yes, indeed, on the one hand, we witnessed the food prices growing. In many ways, it has been brought about in Russia by the global food prices growing. We can see that the global food prices similarly continue their upward price movement, and that creates concerns, but the kind of mechanisms that, for example, the government has come up with respect to grain, we feel is capable of reducing the domestic price volatility and in many ways, restrict the impact from the acute global food price growth upon the domestic market. All of these things will manifest themselves in time. There are long-term effects, short-term effects. Each of them is conditioned by the motivation that the farmers have in trying to adjust to the extension of various mechanisms without the price dumping mechanisms. But nevertheless, we do believe that overall the volatility, the global food prices most probably shall remain at a high level, but the impact of the global food prices going upon the Russian domestic market is going to be restrained. Now, with regard to the financial market situation and the retail investors, we do acknowledge two factors, and that is about the recent upheaval in the U.S. Financial market. First of all, a high-risk strategy pursued by the hedge funds in the stock market, which led to volatility, because we see that the short position investors amounted to about a whole 1/4 of all of the stock outstanding. And this is one of the drivers. And the second driver is when we saw the kind of impact that the retail investors may come up with, united by a common idea, and the ones who are capable of quickly mobilizing with the help of the social networks. As far as the first factor is concerned, this is something that we don't have in the Russian market because the hedge funds are not so active in Russia, but the retail investors already emerge into the stock market, and the various limitations imposed upon the non-qualified investors are very important, because falling victim to a certain strategy, expectations may lead to problems. So we need to study it more and understand whether there are any changes that we should introduce into our regulation as well. Thank you. Next question, please. Olga Jakova, Independent Information Agency from Nizhny Novgorod. In December, agreements were entered into to stabilize prices with the producers, and the prices for sugar and flour oil are going, for sunflower oil are going to be frozen, and that will last until the end of the first quarter. Will Central Bank recommend to extend these agreements? Is it possible to consider the probability of similar agreements to be entered into covering other food staples? You see, it is true that these agreements for sugar and sunflower oil led to the prices for these products going down. We've registered this effect, and as a short-term measure to stabilize prices, such agreements did produce the effect. But in our mind, similar kind of measures, even having positive effect, this could only be short-lived in a short period of time. So they don't need to be prolonged, because if you need to stabilize or to reduce the price volatility, one should apply market mechanisms like it was proposed about the grain, with the dampening kind of mechanism. We don't believe it is common sense to have such agreements cover other products. There's no ground for that right now, and principally speaking, the free market pricing is the core journey that the market should follow, because if you continue applying administrative measures in a limitless kind of an approach, that may have these products fall into a shortage, and it may then overflow onto other kind of goods, the substitutes, and so that is why we exactly think that these kinds of agreements should be very much temporary and short-term. Thank you. Anna Lazareva, Russia 24. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. More than once you mentioned that the real estate market was overheated because of the mortgage lending and the exemptions mortgage lending. What's the current status? What, let's say, if the mortgage programs are suspended, will the real estate prices fall down? Thank you very much for your questions. Once again about our attitude towards the subsidized mortgage lending. It has been a very effective instrument during the acute phase of the crisis, immediately, coming out of it, and it helped to support the construction industry as well as it helped households get loans at a lower rate. But in due time, simply because the supply was not able to keep up with the demand, which was developing in a bit of an agitation kind of way, it all expressed itself into the prices growing. So based on our estimates, by January, speaking about the housing availability, the whole effect from the reduced rate was fully lost because of the built housing growing in prices. So we feel that this program should be gradually curtailed, maybe just leave it for the regions where supply is not sufficient or where the household demands recovered specifically as the result of various restrictions as something of an anti-crisis program related to the pandemic. But it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any subsidized or beneficial exemptions, mortgage lending programs. There should be some. I feel that there should be such programs offered in a certain number of regions where the overall amount of construction commissioned is low because the developers are not interested in the kind of projects which have a low profit margin. And certainly there should be certain programs in place like we have now to support individual social groups, specifically young families, the families with children, because these are the groups of people whose income has the potential to grow. So such programs made into a standing kind of a measure is what we should have. Now, will the prices fall after the programs are over? We feel that they would hardly likely fall, but the price growth in terms of its pace will slow down. And speaking about the price dynamics in the real estate, I know that the government is very much on top of it. It's very important to reduce the costs in construction by applying new materials, new technologies, and shorten all kinds of permitting procedures, which are quite costly and lengthy, so as to aim at reducing the price, so as on that kind of basis to improve the availability of housing. That is very important to look not only into the mortgage and interest rate, but also what the supply can make in terms of its contribution. Next question, Denis Bransky for the Siberian News. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. My question is in continuation of the previous one about the suspension of the subsidized mortgage. In 2020, in our region, we had some unprecedented growth in terms of the social real estate construction, 26%, whereas overall throughout Siberia it was in between 8 to 10%. Does it mean that this is the upper price limit? And I also wanted to ask, is it possible, in view of the subsidized mortgage being suspended, how much that would affect prices? But you already responded to this question. Well, of course, the situation is different in between different regions. Different regions have their own specificities. And the way I put it, I was speaking about the whole domestic trend. And the way I understand, in the Irkutsk region, the housing market and the price dynamics have been affected by the natural calamity taking place in Irkutsk, and a considerable amount of housing was lost, which altogether produced a negative impact upon the price dynamics. It is difficult for me to identify which of the factors was directly linked to the subsidized mortgage program, and as well as taking into account the specific things. But all in all, the subsidized mortgage programs should first and foremost produce the availability, improved availability of housing for people, so that the effect from it couldn't be cannibalized by prices growing. So all of these programs need to be fine-tuned and re-fine-tuned so that could help people solve their housing problems in a systemic way. And as far as the prices are concerned, yes, I've commented on that already. Thank you. Next question, Anna Kaledina from Izvestia. Shortly before the Board of Directors meeting, the EB advised the Board of Directors not to pay attention to the temporary inflation spike, but reduce its rate by 0.5. Did you take that advice, or you don't believe it to be a logical one? Well, during today's Board of Directors meeting, we didn't consider the rate reduction. Moreover, we believe that as the situation develops along our base scenario, we've got some space to maneuver in order to ease in as far as the easing of the monetary policy is exhausted. But when the bank was coming up with its ideas, it was acting on the less disinflationist scenario than we had in our forecast. We do have the same one because in the main guidelines of our monetary policy development we've described it, but in our mind the situation currently is developing not towards the disinflationary one, but rather towards closer to the pro-inflationary one. So here our estimates in terms of the International Monetary Fund are different with this institution, I grant you. And by the way, there are other experts in the market who do see the situation differently. We prepare our forecast, we explain the rationale behind it, and we make our decision based on the way we see the situation and based upon our forecast. Roman Markelov, Rossiyskaya Gazeta. What does the Central Bank of Russia thinks about the households? Sorry, the question disappeared from my screen. What is the way that the Bank of Russia assesses the credit burden of the household? Is it going to grow after the pandemic? Will the quality of the mortgage loans worsen because of the subsidized mortgage lending program? As far as the debt burden indicator is concerned, generally speaking, if one is to measure the debt and the indebtedness of the households to its income, in 2020 the debt burden indicator overall grew because the indebtedness of the households, the retail loans, have been growing quite quickly, and in the first place thanks to the subsidized mortgage program, and the incomes have been growing as well. I mean, a bit less, but still. And so the debt burden indicator has somewhat nudged upwards. Apparently, that will continue throughout 2021. I mean, the household lending will be growing a little bit faster than the household incomes. In many ways, this kind of a lending is going to support the economic growth. But there is something that I would like to draw attention to. I mean, whatever we see in monitoring these loans, the quality of these loans didn't worsen in many ways. And as far as the banks are concerned, they started offering new loans to borrowers with a less debt burden. I mean, to the individuals who have already accumulated a sizable debt. And if the debt burden indicator continues to grow, but it'll continue growing because of more and more people are going to be participating in the retail borrowing, that, principally speaking, is going to be a normal process, and that would mean a deeper penetration of retail lending. But we will definitely track and trace these whole situations and look at it in terms of the systemic risks, and in case we will feel certain reservations with regard to certain risks, we do have the necessary toolkit in our disposal, including the macroprudential regulation measures, and various ratios could be envisaged in order for this process to get normalized. So we feel that right now there is an absolutely normal and adequate trend, is what we see. Thank you. Next question is Ivan Shlikin, formag.ru. Elvira Nabiullina, good afternoon. Recently, more specifically since the beginning of February, several times the President of Russia was talking about investor protection, and the Minister of Finance also referred to that topic. Now, the fact that this particular issue has gone up to such a high level, has it in any way affected the kind of work that the Bank of Russia does in this area? Well, this is the subject that we've initiated several years ago, and we were behind pushing for the legislation which would distinguish between the qualified and non-qualified investors so as to provide adequate protection to the non-qualified ones. This draft law really took a lot of time to debate. There have been very broad discussions because the market players were quite worried about the procedures getting changed and various tests and checks. So a compromise decision was ultimately arrived at, according to which the main mechanism will switch into action as of April 2022. But the situation being changed, I mean, that people started looking for better yields, and with the deposit rates going down, led to 2020 seeing the household becoming keenly interested into the stock market instruments. So the leg of time, a sort of period of time which has been envisaged in the very beginning, so as to have these whole changes taking a very steady and easy kind of an evolution. So we have raised this issue to protect the rights of non-qualified investors when seeing not just single cases, but multiple cases of mis-selling when, in the guise of the protected instruments, under the guise of modifying their deposits, very complex structured investment instruments were being sold to households and retail investors. And that was why we came out with the initiative to introduce changes and amendments into the legislation. This kind of legislation, this draft law, has been prepared by the Russian MPs, and we're quite positive about it and hope that it will come into effect shortly. So in the meantime, it is not yet in effect, and so to all of the financial institutions, we have forwarded very much of a strong advice not to sell complex products to non-qualified investors. And I must say that the predominant majority of financial institutions really demonstrated a very serious attitude towards it because they do value long-term loyalty from their customers. And so we hope that this whole process is going to be well regulated by the legislation. Thank you. Maria Stepanova from TASS agency. Yeah, we can't hear. We can't hear the sound. Maria, we don't hear you. Her microphone doesn't work. All right, next question comes from Pavel Kazarnovsky from RBK. In December, January, the Russian banking sector, for the first time during the past 3 years, was on the verge of the structural liquidity deficits. In February, the situation changed dramatically. At a certain point in time, the surplus exceeded 3.3 trillion rubles. The analysts related it to the activities by the Minister of Finance with the closing of the deposits and the OFZ placements. How does the Bank of Russia evaluate the growing influence from this particular indicator, and how does Minister of Finance is involved in it? Are there any risks to the banks, and if so, what are the instruments that the Bank of Russia could cushion that? Does the Bank of Russia plan to increase its offerings? I can't read the end of the question on the screen. Sorry. All right, let me start answering the first part of it. Yes, it is true that we've noted very dramatic liquidity fluctuations last year and respectively in the beginning of this year as well. One should say that overall, last year witnessed a structural liquidity surplus. And it went down not because of the Minister of Finance actions, but because of the outflow of cash. And that was a significant part in the evolution of the liquidity surplus. However, in the end of the last year, beginning of this year, the Minister of Finance actions very strongly changed things around. We were in the realm of the strong liquidity surplus, but currently we're back into the structured liquidity surplus. In our mind, that, as I previously stated, didn't affect the monetary conditions. We simply readjusted our transactions. We were doing it one by one, repo and the deposits, in order to compensate for that changing liquidity environment. And so from the point of view of the banks,
the fact that the Minister of Finance was not placing out something, they could get it through our transacting and give it back at the time that the Minister of Finance would be ready to come out with its placements. So these fluctuations of liquidity do happen, and with this in mind, we do maintain our long-term repo auctions, and so that the banks could feel comfortable and understand that at any point in time they can have this money from the central bank. Yes, and the overall forecast with respect to where the system is going to end up being, we also believe that this year there will be a structural liquidity surplus somewhere at the level as we're seeing right now, maybe give or take, because of the cash flows and because of the Minister of Finance involvement. Elena Fabricna, Reuters, has the central bank considered at its today's meeting the question of rising the rate? Yes, as I previously stated, we didn't consider bringing it down. We primarily were looking into maintaining it as it is, and had a discussion about possible trajectories, about possible timelines, and the pace of neutralization. Clearly, right now, there's not enough information in order for us to reach any sort of a certainty. Tatiana Chubaisova from Interfax, please. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. My question is not about the monetary policy. Towards the end of the year, the central bank really made us feel happy with the news about the future practices that it does in terms of introducing external management into Moskovsky Bank and the Odkrytie Bank. Could you update us about this information and how negotiations are taking place between the central bank and the Provsvyaz Bank by having it take on its management external management of the Industrialny Bank, and also about the discovery of Odkrytie Bank? Towards the end of December, the central bank said that in 2022 it plans to float some of the stock, but also considers selling the whole group off, or some of its parts, to a strategic investor. Could you specify which companies in that group were meant? Because I couldn't really construe that from the press release. Thank you. Thank you. Let me begin by saying and confirming again our policy towards exiting from the equity of the banks which are currently being brought into compliance. There's ATB Bank, which we're preparing for divestiture, and there are already investors who demonstrate interest. In far as the Minb Bank is concerned, we are talking to Provsvyaz Bank. Currently, Provsvyaz Bank is doing its due diligence of the ANB Bank, so it's premature to talk about any specific activities. We will further discuss it. In as far as the Odkrytie, the Discovery Bank, is concerned, indeed, this is a bit of a fork road that we're at right now, to either sell the group in the whole or just do it piecemeal and separately, including it to strategic investors, because there is a demand for different assets, and what I mean here is about the pension funds and the insurance company in the structure of it. We currently are working with investment advisors, and amongst various issues that they need to work on is to weigh all these optionalities and present various strong characteristics or shortages, or we will consider that, and we hope that towards the end of spring, beginning of summer, we will make a decision, because as the situation evolves, various things are going to become more specific, and that would give us better grounds to make a decision. But I hope that in the beginning of 22 we'll start selling Odkrytie Group. That definitely will depend upon the economic environment, but we are willing to start doing it, and our internal plans and the way we work with the investment advisors is basically point to this time frame. Andrei Birikov from Bloomberg, another question. Yes, once again, good afternoon. I have a question about Bitcoin. The cryptocurrency is reaching its new historic maximum level against the backdrop of being recognized by the biggest banks, companies, and the payment systems. So what is the Bank of Russia attitude towards the cryptocurrency? And when should we expect the crypto ruble to come out? And will it be able to compete against the current cryptocurrencies? Well, honestly speaking, my attitude hasn't changed at all towards the cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, because this particular price hike points to very strong volatility potential in such currencies. And honestly, the Bitcoin price even doesn't affect its core essence, because we believe that it is not a currency. So without doubt, I mean, people have an interest towards these currencies, but the risks that there have been in the past, about them still remain, and they may become even stronger. And the fact that this is a very volatile asset, I mean, it grows very fast in its pricing, but in the similar token, it may fall back very quickly. And secondly, it can be actively resorted to for all kinds of dubious transactions. We've witnessed that. As far as the digital ruble is concerned, this is a totally different topic, because it is true that we are undergoing very active discussions of an advisory report with respect to the digital ruble, and we want to consider the possible model for it, because in the report there have been 4 models described, and we can see that the market players are demonstrating their preference towards one of them, and we will then be making an announcement once this process is over. The main thing for us is to very clearly, very precisely prescribe, as well as understand, as a result of the debate with the market players, and understand what could be the advantages of the digital ruble, how will they manifest both for the businesses and the households. We do see such advantages, despite the fact that there are different remote forms of banking services and cashless payments developing, but we do ascertain that there could be very strong interest towards the digital ruble, and we're also not mindless of various risks. So in preliminary way, I can say, and we'll reflect it in our concept text of the report, that these risks are limited, they're quite manageable and could be controlled, and you could foresee reducing them in the model. And secondly, in the gradualness of the way the digital ruble could be introduced into the market. So at the digital ruble, yes, we're going to finish our discussions and we'll present the concept and we'll move on. Anatoly Pistich from TASS, previously Minister of Industry and Trade, proposed to reduce the acquiring fee again. Do you allow for any repetitive introduction of restrictions for that particular fee by the banks? We, for quite some time indeed, have been discussing the acquiring fee, because we've introduced certain systemic restrictions related to various socially significant types of services and products. Apart from that, we also introduced a regulation covering the pandemic period. However, we wouldn't like to turn it into a systemic regulation. We're certainly going to be monitoring the situation in case the acquiring fees rates, if they're going to grow, then at any point in time we would be ready to apply these measures which allow us to reduce the growth of rates. But we do see that these acquiring fees are not conditioned by any bank's business model and enabled to fund various banks incurred by the banks when installing the POS terminals, so overall developing the cashless form of payment, and make such cashless payments convenient for the businesses and household. Secondly, some part of the acquiring fee is rebated to the consumers in the form of cashbacks and the loyalty scores. And when we saw that during the pandemic we limited the acquiring fees, some of the banks started giving up on such programs. So that calls for a wholesome business model, and we do believe that the main thing is to provide the businesses and the households with alternative mechanisms, including through the fast payment system, instant payment system, so to say, and we're currently actively developing the QR coded payments, which again should be very convenient to households. So people must have a choice between different forms. And so I believe that competition in this case is the main thing which will help to reduce tariffs and will exert pressure upon these tariffs not being high. Anastasia Saprikina, RIA Novosti. What is the size of the cashless payments towards the end of 2020 you could register, and what is the current dynamic within this year? So based on the results of 2020, we've come up to about 70% of the cashless payments, which is more than we expected in the beginning of the year. Of course, in the pandemic environment, there was an additional stimulus to resort to use cashless payments, plus our various regulatory measures that I've described made cashless payments more attractive. So we think that the share of cashless payments will continue growing, but that will be in just percentage points, because the level of cashless payment penetration in this country is very high, and so every percentage point is going to be a struggle, but nevertheless the share of cashless payments is going to definitely grow. Oh, that was the last question, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for your attention and for your questions, and see you soon.